My name is Eleanor Mercer. I'm 78, and I spent 30 years keeping other people's books straight. 3 decades of balancing columns that belonged to somebody else. Payroll, ledgers, quarterly statements, the slow, honest arithmetic of whether a man could make his rent for half the small businesses in Marion, Ohio. Numbers never once lied to me. They don't pat your hand and call you sweetheart. They don't talk over you at the dinner table. They sit exactly where you put them and tell you the truth. Every single time, whether or not the truth is comfortable. 3 weeks ago, on the night of my 78th birthday, my grandson Derek stood at the head of my own dinner table, the table where I still wash the plates by hand, in his pressed charcoal blazer, swirling a glass of my wine, and told a room full of his friends that he'd already spent the $200,000 I was leaving him. Already spent it, as if I were a date on a calendar he was waiting to flip past. Then he leaned toward his wife and said, just loud enough for me to hear over the clinking of forks, "Grandma isn't thinking straight anymore." He didn't know there was an envelope in the inside pocket of my blazer. He didn't know what I'd done 3 months before, in a quiet office on Court Street, with a man I'd trusted for 40 years. He didn't know that the money he had already borrowed against, spent, and bragged about was never going to come. If you've ever been treated as though your mind had already left the room while you were still sitting right there in it, stay with me tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one of them. But to understand the envelope, you have to understand the 30 years that came before it, and the 4 years before that, and the kind of woman who keeps a notebook in her apron pocket long after anyone is paying her to. So let me take you back. I was 26 the first time someone handed me a shoebox full of receipts and asked me to make sense of his life. He was a man named Sal Petrino, who ran a feed store out on Route 4, and he sat across from me with his hat in his hands and admitted he had no idea whether he was making money or quietly going broke. He was too proud to ask his own brother and too scared to ask the bank. I sorted that shoebox in one long afternoon at my kitchen table, sharpened my pencil twice, and handed him a single clean page that told him exactly where he stood. I will never forget the way his shoulders came down from around his ears. That was the work. Not the math. Anyone can do the math. The work was giving a frightened person the truth in a form they could finally hold. For 30 years I did that. Farmers, a hardware store, 2 diners, a trucking outfit, the little print shop on Main that's a vape store now. I retired at 65 with a good name, a paid-off house on Linden Street, and a set of habits I never managed to put down. I still keep a little notebook in my apron pocket. Every dollar in, every dollar out, in my own hand, the date in the left margin, the way I was taught. And every single night, no matter who has been at the table, I wash the dinner plates by hand, at the same sink, in the same kitchen, where I have washed them for 50 years. My granddaughter offers to do it. I tell her the warm water is good for my hands. The truth is simpler than that. It is the one place in the world where I am still entirely in charge, and a woman my age learns to hold on to those. My husband Walter passed 4 years ago, in the spring, the way good men sometimes do, quietly, in his chair with the radio on. We built everything together over 51 years. The house, the savings, set aside a little at a time. A small rental duplex across town that Walter painted himself 2 summers running. When he was gone, all of it came to me, to manage, and in time, to direct. I want you to hold on to that word, direct. Not hand over, not wait to be relieved of. It was mine, every dollar of it. Mine to give where I saw fit. I had earned the right to decide, and I never once forgot it, no matter how many people around me seemed to. Years back, the 2 of us had signed a will at that same kitchen table, with Frank Holloway reading it over the top of his glasses. In it, our grandson Derek, the oldest of the grandchildren, the first in the whole family to finish college, was left $200,000. A real sum, a door-opening, life-changing sum. I was proud of that boy then, and I want to be honest about it. Because the part of this story that hurts isn't the money. It's that I once stood in his college gymnasium and cried watching him cross a stage. But somewhere in the years after Walter, Derek stopped seeing me. He didn't stop visiting, that's the strange part. He visited more. He'd come by on a Sunday, and his eyes would move around my house the way an appraiser's eyes move, sliding over the rooms, totaling things up. He'd ask too casually how the rental was renting. He'd ask whether the savings were just sitting there. He'd run his hand along the banister Walter built and say, "Grandma, you really shouldn't be doing all this yourself." For a long time, I let myself believe it was kindness. That is the trap they count on, that you would rather believe in kindness than in arithmetic. But I have spent my whole life with arithmetic, and arithmetic does not flinch. My granddaughter Hannah never talked like that. Hannah is 27. She works double shifts at the county hospital, comes home with her feet aching, and still drives 40 minutes every Sunday to sit at my kitchen table and ask how I really am, and then waits for the real answer, not the polite one. She has never once mentioned the will. I don't believe it has ever crossed her mind that there is one. She brings me the seeded bread I like and stories about her patients, and she dries the dishes I wash, and she has no idea, to this day, what she was about to be handed. And on Tuesdays, I'd tell the family I was going to visit a friend. They would nod, that slow, patient nod people give an old woman with her simple little habits. Bless her, off to her tea. They had no idea who I was really going to see, or that the woman they were already calling forgetful was on those Tuesday mornings balancing the most important set of books of her entire life. It was Hannah who, without ever meaning to, showed me the shape of what was coming. She had stopped by Derek's place to drop off a casserole, and she came to me afterward looking pale and quiet. "Grandma," she said, sitting down slow, "I think Derek's in real trouble with money. There's a car in the garage I don't think he can afford, and Megan looked like she'd been crying." I didn't pry. I didn't have to. I am a bookkeeper. I know how to read a room the way I read a column, by what doesn't add up. So over the next several weeks, I simply paid attention. At family dinners, Derek talked too loudly and too soon about a future that depended on money he didn't have yet, a bigger house down the line, a trip once things came through. Came through. He never finished those sentences with where the money would come from, but I could hear the missing words, the way you hear a number that's been left out of a total. And then, one afternoon, he stood in my driveway taking a phone call, and the kitchen window was cracked open behind him, and I heard him say it plainly, easily, the way you say a thing you've already said 100 times. "It's fine. It's all coming to me anyway. Grandma isn't thinking straight anymore. We'll have power of attorney before spring. Trust me, it's handled." Power of attorney. Before spring. Handled. I stood very still at that sink with my hands in the warm water. Then I dried them, sat down at the table, opened my notebook, and made myself put the pieces into their columns. Because that is what I do when my hands want to shake. I write it down. Writing it down has gotten me through every hard thing in my life, including the spring Walter didn't wake up. Here's what the column said. Derek had spent the inheritance before he ever had a dollar of it. Not figuratively. $85,000 on a sports car, the one in the garage that had frightened Hannah, bought on credit against money he did not yet possess. $70,000 poured into a business, some online venture with a partner who, I would later learn, had already cleared out and stopped answering his phone. It folded inside a year and left nothing but a logo and a loan. And $45,000 more on credit cards and personal lines of credit, swiped a little at a time, against a number he'd somehow learned was sitting in my will. 85 and 70 and 45. I added it twice to be sure, the way I always do. $200,000. The exact figure in the will, to the dollar. My grandson hadn't merely counted my money. He had already lost it. And somewhere out there were papers with his signature on them to prove it. And he had done one thing more. The thing that turned my grief into something with a spine. To make certain the rest of it came to him before I could ever think better of it, he had been telling people, his wife Megan, a neighbor or two, even a cousin who works down at the bank, that I was slipping, that I forgot things, that I'd left the stove on once, which I had not, that somebody responsible really ought to be helping poor Grandma with her affairs before she did something foolish. He wasn't planning to inherit. He was planning to take. And to do it cleanly, he needed a doctor's worried note and a judge's signature agreeing that I was no longer fit to stop him. Have you ever found out that someone you raised, someone you cried for at a graduation, was quietly counting the days until you were gone? Tell me in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who has sat alone in a quiet kitchen with that particular kind of cold settling into her chest. I read every word. So that next Tuesday, I did not go to visit a friend. I drove myself, with my own two hands on the wheel and my own clear eyes on the road, to a quiet office on Court Street. The man behind the desk was Frank Holloway. Frank and I have known each other 40 years. He drew up the papers when Walter passed, and his father drew up papers for my own mother before that. Frank is the only man in the county who has never once, not in 4 decades, spoken to me slowly. Now, here is what Derek never imagined, the thing the whole night turned on. 3 months before that birthday dinner, long before he ever said the word incompetent out loud, long before he set his little stage, I had already been to see Frank. I had already done the arithmetic. I had watched the inspection visits pile up, felt the air in my own house change. And a bookkeeper learns to act on a bad trend long before it hardens into a loss. You do not wait for the business to fail to write down that it is failing. We had quietly drawn up a new will. In it, the $200,000 and the rest of my estate, the house on Linden Street, the duplex Walter painted, the savings we'd built dollar by dollar, went to my granddaughter Hannah, with a portion set firmly into a trust for my great-grandson, little Sam. Sam is 4 years old. He calls me G because he couldn't manage Grandma, and he loves me without the faintest idea in his small head that love can be turned into a transaction. In that new will, Derek's name appeared exactly once, in a single plain line stating that he was to receive no bequest, and that the loans already extended to him over the years were his to keep, along with whatever else he had chosen to owe. And I had done one thing more, the thing that mattered most of all. On that very first Tuesday, Frank had walked me down the hall to a specialist's office, and I sat for a full cognitive evaluation. I answered every question. I named the date, the season, the president, the town. I counted backward from 100 by sevens without a stumble. I balanced every little figure they slid across the desk to test me. It is all on file now, signed, dated, and notarized. This woman is of entirely sound and competent mind. If Derek ever stood in front of a judge to call his grandmother confused, that judge would be holding, in the same hand, the sworn proof that I had been the sharpest person in every room I'd walked into. The new will went into a sealed envelope. I carried it home, tucked it into the inside pocket of my good navy blazer, and hung that blazer in the closet by the front door, where it waited, quiet as a held breath, for 3 months. Then I did the hardest thing this whole story ever asked of me. Nothing. I let Derek go on believing he was winning. When he telephoned a few weeks later, bright as a salesman, to plan A real birthday dinner, Grandma, to celebrate you, and offered to host it right here at my house so it's easier on you. I told him that sounded lovely. I told him to bring his friends. I poured his coffee with my own steady hand and let him go on thinking the old woman hadn't noticed a single thing, that her stove was off, her mind was gone, and her money was as good as his. If you've ever had to smile warmly at someone while you quietly, carefully protected yourself from them, then you know the exact weight of those weeks. It is the loneliest patience there is. Leave a comment and tell me about your own. I am right here, reading everyone. The night of my 78th birthday came on a cold Friday in November, with the first real frost silvering the windows. Derek arrived an hour early to set up, which meant rearranging my own house to look the way he wanted the evening to look, pushing the good chairs around, dimming the lamps, setting out a bottle of wine with a label he clearly wanted everyone to notice. He brought Megan, who moved through my kitchen like she was measuring it for curtains. He brought 3 friends from his office, pleasant young men who shook my hand, called me ma'am, and plainly had no idea why they'd been invited to an old woman's birthday. They were there to be an audience. They simply didn't know yet for which play. Hannah came too, with little Sam, who ran straight across the room and pressed a crayon drawing into my hands, a wobbly house with too many windows and a yellow sun in the corner. "That's your house, G," he told me seriously. I put it on the refrigerator, where it still is. And at 6:30, exactly as I had quietly asked him to, Frank Holloway arrived in his good coat with a slim leather folder tucked under his arm. Derek met him at the door and pumped his hand. "Frank, good of you to come," he said, warm and easy, never once stopping to wonder why a family lawyer might bring a folder to a birthday party. I made Walter's pot roast, his mother's recipe, the one I've made 100 times. We ate at the table where I have washed the plates by hand for 50 years. The talk was loud and pleasant. Derek poured the wine freely and laughed at his friends' jokes, relaxed in the particular way of a man who believes the ending of the evening is already written, and that he is the one who wrote it. Every few minutes his eyes flicked to me with a soft, patient pity, the kind you'd aim at a child or a pet. I let him. I cut Sam's meat into small pieces, and I let him. And after the cake, chocolate, because Sam had requested chocolate with the gravity of a senator. With his friends settled and his wife at his elbow, Derek stood, tapped his glass with a knife, and gave the little speech he had so plainly been rehearsing. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about family. He talked about legacy, a word that sounded strange and rented in his mouth. And then, smiling, looking around at his audience, he said it to the entire room. "Look, we all know Grandma isn't really thinking straight anymore. God love her. So I've gone ahead and started getting things in order for her, taking the weight off. And honestly, that $200,000, I've already put it to work. The car, a little business, getting our future set up. It's what Grandma would want. Right, Grandma?" A couple of his friends chuckled, unsure. Megan nodded along, eyes on her plate. And Hannah went very, very still beside me, her fork halfway to nowhere. I set down my napkin, and I stood up. Slowly. My knees are not what they were, and I have stopped apologizing for it. I reached into the inside pocket of my navy blazer, and I took out the envelope. "I do have something to say tonight," I said, into a room that had gone quiet all at once. "Seeing as we're on the subject of who can think straight." I opened the envelope, and then, in the same clear, even voice I had used for 30 years to tell frightened people exactly where their money had gone, I read the new will aloud. I read the date at the top, 3 months back, in plain ink. I read that the entire estate, the $200,000 included, the house, the duplex, the savings, was left to my granddaughter Hannah and to a trust for my great-grandson Samuel. I read the single line that named Derek and assigned to him every debt he had made. And then Last, I read the notarized letter, signed and stamped by a physician, stating that Eleanor Mercer was of sound and certain mind on the day she signed. The room did not make a sound. I folded the letter and set it on the table. Frank, without hurry, slid his leather folder beside it, opened it to show the filed and witnessed copies, and said quietly into the silence, "It's all in order. Filed, witnessed, and notarized. There's nothing to contest." Derek had gone the exact color of the tablecloth. I watched it happen, watched the arithmetic land on him all at once. The $85,000 car in the garage, the $70,000 business that had already failed, the $45,000 in credit lines, $200,000 already spent, now sitting on the wrong side of a will he had just heard read aloud in front of the very friends he'd invited to watch him win. Have you ever watched a person realize, in real time, that the trap they so carefully built has only one man left standing inside it? Don't answer me yet. Let me tell you what came after, because the after is the part that matters. It did not end in shouting. I have never once raised my voice in that house, and I was certainly not going to begin at 78. It ended the way a bad account always ends, quietly, in numbers that finally, simply have to be faced. Derek's friends remembered, all at once, somewhere else they had to be. Megan gathered her coat without quite managing to look at me. Derek himself stood in my doorway, and for the first time in years, he had no speech ready, no easy phrase, no soft, pitying smile. The debts did not vanish when the inheritance did. The car, the dead business, the credit lines, $200,000 owed against money that was never now going to arrive. Those papers carried his signature, not mine, and signatures are stubborn things. By the next week, word had moved through Marion the way word always does in a town that small, and the whole story turned itself over. The grandson who'd been telling everyone his grandmother was losing her mind turned out to be the one who had lost $200,000 betting she would fade out quietly and on schedule. The same neighbors who used to give me those gentle, pitying looks at the grocery began giving me something else entirely, a small, careful, unmistakable respect. Hannah cried when she finally understood. Not about the money. Never the money. She tried, honestly tried to refuse it, right there at my sink with a dish towel in her hands. I told her no. I told her the estate had always been mine to direct, and that I was directing it, with a clear and documented mind, toward the one person who had shown up on Sundays when there was nothing on this earth to gain by it. Sam's trust will be waiting for him when he's grown. A quiet gift from a great-grandmother he will only half remember, who loved him fiercely before he could spell his own name, back when he called her G. And Derek, I will tell you exactly what I told him, standing in that doorway in the cold. "You are welcome at my table any Sunday you like," I said, "but you are not welcome in my accounts. You confused the two. That was your mistake, not my memory." I have not closed the door on him. A will is not a verdict, and I am his grandmother before I am anyone's bookkeeper. If he ever comes back to me as a grandson instead of as a creditor, there is still a chair for him at that table, and there always will be. But he will not manage me. He will not repackage a clear-headed woman as a confused one, simply because being clear is inconvenient to his arithmetic. I would have helped him if he had only asked me as family. What I will not do is be robbed by someone who first needed to convince the world I couldn't tell I was being robbed. Because there is a particular cruelty in telling an old woman she isn't thinking straight. It is never truly about her mind. It is about needing her to stop seeing what she plainly, painfully sees. I spent 30 years keeping the truth in straight, honest columns for people too frightened to face their own. And I am not about to let anyone smudge the last few entries of my own life just because they don't care for the total at the bottom. So every night, I still wash the plates by hand, at the same sink, in the same kitchen, with the warm water good on my hands. And every night, I still write the day's numbers in my little notebook, in my own steady, certain hand. The date in the left margin, the way I was taught. If you have ever had to protect your own dignity quietly, with no one in the room to applaud, no one to tell you that you did right, then tell me in the comments. Tell me about the moment someone underestimated you and learned too late that you had seen the whole thing coming, calm and clear, from a long way off. I read every single word, and I sit with everyone. The books are balanced. They always were. I'm the one who kept them.